I'm Seb Bilo. I'm the head of research at WHEB Asset Management. And I'm going to be introducing our impact report today. We published this at the end of June. So just turning to the impact report, we decided this year to go with a cover of a wildfire this year, which reflects really the extreme urgency that we now feel about the need to tackle climate change. You may have heard that last week temperatures in the UK were higher than they have ever been in recorded history, and we had our own wildfires in this country, which is something which is still quite unusual. Obviously, that's different for you in Australia, where you've had quite a lot of experience with wildfires. And this prediction of extreme weather really is something that we hardly need to do every year now, because it's almost a given that we'll be breaking records of one sort or another. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, actually published a report in April this year that was billed in effect as their final warning that the time is indeed now to commit to the wholesale change that we need to see in the global economy if we are to transition to a net zero carbon and more sustainable economy with a safe, stable climate and biosphere that we depend upon. So in terms of some of the key highlights from the impact report, this idea of change is something that we think is central to impact investing, and it's something that we highlight in the report. The idea of impact investing really is to deliver an investment return, of course, but also to help deliver change. And companies that we invest in take inputs in the form of capital and labor and so on, conduct their activities, and generate outputs in the form of products and services. And these products and services have positive impacts that ultimately lead to positive outcomes on key social and environmental issues. And our report sets out this theory of change and the related problem statements that our investments are trying to address for the strategy as a whole and for each of the investment themes. So, for example, at the level of the strategy as a whole, our theory of change is that the global economy currently consumes resources at a rate that is unsustainable. WHEB's investment strategy invests in companies that sell products and services that provide solutions to these challenges and that protect and enhance the quality of life. So that's the strategy, the theory of change for the strategy as a whole, which is necessarily quite high level, given that we have 9 different investment themes. But we have a much clearer articulation of the key problems that we're trying to solve at the level of each investment theme. So, for example, for our resource efficiency theme, the problem statement is that in order to meet a target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050 and keep global warming to less than 1.5 degrees centigrade, the global economy needs to increase energy efficiency by more than 4% per annum from 2020 to 2030. So that's the problem statement. And we then have 3 different areas that we focus on in the investment theme, where we've developed a theory of change for each of those companies, detailing how their products and services address this problem. So, for example, A.O. Smith in our more efficient buildings sub-theme sells water heating equipment, including efficient electric boilers and heat pumps that go into buildings. ANSYS sells software tools that enable more efficient product design and development, and Power Integrations sell semiconductor chips that enable much more efficient electrical equipment, particularly in homes and residences. So you can see how each of those 3 businesses, the products and services that they sell, directly help to address that problem statement. And we have a similar approach for all of our other themes, and indeed for every single investment that we make. And those are detailed in the impact report. And this is what makes our impact calculator relatively straightforward to calculate, because each investment is connected with a particular theme, and in the majority of cases is linked with a specific performance indicator, whether that's renewable energy generated or numbers of people receiving healthcare. And over the 6 years that we've put together the impact data, we've gone from around 40% of the portfolio reporting data to nearly 60% this year. Interestingly though, the proportion that don't report has stayed pretty static at around 20%, and the other 20% last year was estimated. So we calculate impact data using enterprise value, including cash, as the denominator, which is a slight change from last year. But more importantly, we now report data based on the holdings in the portfolio throughout the year. Until this year, the impact was associated with the holdings in the strategy at the end of the year. This year, we've done a calculation that includes prorated contributions from companies that we sold during the year. So, for example, if we held a company from January until June and then sold it in June, previously we wouldn't have included it. This year, we have included the 6 months contribution to the impact. And like last year, all our data has been scrutinized by the Carbon Trust and found to be robust for the purposes of the impact calculator. The other thing that we've done this year is that we've been conscious for some time that while the main impact of the products and services that are produced by portfolio companies is positive, they sometimes also have some negative impacts. So, for example, we invest in businesses that make COVID tests, and I think we can all agree that they've been pretty essential, sadly, for the last 2 years in terms of keeping people healthy, or at least letting you know when you've got COVID. But they created a lot of additional plastic waste as a negative impact associated with that. Companies typically don't report these negative impacts, and so they are very difficult to quantify, apart from carbon, which I'll come back to. But we do provide some disclosures in the report as to what we think the principal negative impacts are. So just turning to carbon, we report a pretty comprehensive data set for the carbon characteristics of the portfolio. And in fact, increasingly, this is a sort of standardized set of metrics that you need to report if you're a member of the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which we are. And there are basically three stories here, which I want to highlight for you. The first is on the left-hand side, the metrics basically cover the scope 1 and 2 emissions of the portfolio. So the carbon emissions that are associated with the operations of the businesses that we invest in. And you can see that we've seen a really quite dramatic decline in carbon emissions from 2020 to 2021. And there are two principal reasons for that. The first is that we sold a company called China Everbright Environment Group, which is a waste to energy operator in China. We sold it for several reasons. Two of which were, the first was that we've concluded that energy from waste is no longer really a solution to an environmental problem. Previously, we considered that particularly in emerging economies where waste management infrastructure was still a bit immature, we considered waste to energy a preferable way of managing waste than landfill, let alone just dumping it in the environment. However, waste infrastructure has improved now in most of these countries, and we don't think burning waste, even if you get the energy back from it, is really a sustainable solution. Really, you should be recycling it. So that was one reason we sold. Another reason was because we had asked them to set a net zero carbon target, and they'd been quite resistant to doing that. And we've always reserved the right to divest from businesses who haven't taken these issues as seriously as we think they should. So that was another reason that we sold, and that was behind a large part of the decline from 2020 to 21. The other reason, just very quickly, is because actually the rest of the portfolio has got better. Their carbon intensity metrics in particular, so the carbon emitted per unit of revenue, for example, has improved, which of course is really important because that's where we need to get the reductions from, really. It's not really good enough just to sell companies. We need to see reductions in the companies that are in the portfolio. And then on the right-hand side, just a couple of points here. The first is that our scope 3 emissions, which are relatively high and remain high, the reason for that is because we tend to invest in businesses where the products are using energy or electricity. Like the example I gave earlier on with A.O. Smith, although their equipment is more efficient than other competitors in the market, they have more energy efficient water heaters, they still use a lot of electricity, just less than the competing technology uses. So they still have a significant scope 3 carbon footprint. And then the final story in this data, which we're also really pleased about, is just underneath that in terms of the net zero carbon commitments. We have a policy of getting all of our portfolio to commit to being net zero carbon by 2050 at the latest, and the deadline for that is 2030. We also had a target for 2025 to get to 50% of the portfolio having set that a target. And we were at 44% at the end of last year, up from just 2% just 2 years beforehand. At the end of June, we just went through 50%. So about 53% of the portfolio have now set a net zero carbon commitment by 2050 at the latest. So we're really pleased to be able to hit that target 2.5 years before, 2.5 years earlier than we'd expected to. So that's the sort of carbon, the key messages from the carbon analysis of the portfolio. We also do a lot of engagement work. This is something that's very important to us, and we believe it's very important to our investors as well. We engaged with on 156 occasions in 2021 with 41 companies, which represents nearly 80% of the portfolio. And these aren't just, firing off a letter. These are deep engagements that often involve multiple interactions with the company. And you can see on the right-hand side, we also assess the effectiveness of that engagement. And you can see that the long-term story here, this is data going back to 2014, the long-term story is pretty good. We've significantly increased the proportion of our engagement that we consider to be either partially or completely successful. And the proportion that's unsuccessful has declined pretty dramatically over that period. We have seen a bit of a tick down in the proportion of successful engagements in 2021. And we think the main reason for that is because we are now asking more difficult things from companies. In the past, there were some relatively easy wins around getting them to produce a sustainability report or develop a sustainability policy. Now we're asking them to change their performance, to reduce their carbon emissions or to improve gender diversity or whatever it is. And those things take time. And we think that's partly why we're seeing this increase in unsuccessful engagements. And then finally on this chart, the other thing that we're very conscious of is it's very difficult to claim responsibility for any of those changes, to attribute the change to us, to our interaction with the company. We think that that's too simplistic. Companies change their policies for all sorts of reasons, but we hope that WHEB is driving them in the right direction. And we do have quotes from companies saying that WHEB has been a big part of their journey. We had a quote from Intertek last year, the UK company. This year we have a quote from Smurfit Kappa, which has been in the portfolio for many years. They're a recycled cardboard manufacturer. So finally, before I hand over to Claire, I did want to just leave you on a positive note, which isn't so easy perhaps at the moment with a lot of difficult times this year. Some of you may remember that we gave a rather gloomy outlook at the end of last year, where we were talking about Russia's belligerent posturing towards Ukraine. This was still before they invaded, the return of inflation, the likelihood of extreme weather, the continuing fallout from the COVID pandemic, lots of fairly gloomy narratives. And at the time we felt that was pretty gloomy, but it turns out that actually we perhaps weren't gloomy enough in terms of what we thought would happen. And this is particularly true with regard to climate change, I think, where it's been a particularly tough period, concluding most recently with the end of President Biden's ambitions to pass comprehensive legislation on climate through the US Senate. I am conscious, of course, that we have a much more progressive administration in Australia, which is good news. But the wider backdrop hasn't been great, I would say. But it is our experience over the decades that we've spent analysing capital markets that the media headlines often miss underlying tectonic shifts in industry. And one of these shifts was revealed in BP's latest Energy Outlook report. All three of BP's scenarios now model at most a peaking of carbon emissions. And actually the underlying data shows that total fossil fuel demand in 2021 was less than it was in 2019. And that all of the increase in energy supply since 2019 has come from non-fossil sources. Solar and wind are now 5% of primary energy supply and are growing at about 20% per year. And total energy demand growth is about 1%. So solar and wind are now accounting for all of this growth. And it is in fact highly possible, if not in fact probable, that carbon emissions from energy use and industrial processes globally actually peaked in 2019. And if it didn't, we are at or very near that peak. The key question now is how quickly we can get emissions to decline.